The river woke before the house did, curling fog off its shoulders and breathing a damp whisper through the cane. Eveline stood at the kitchen door with her palms dusted in flour, watching the horizon bruise from indigo to a reluctant gray. She counted the slow pulse in her wrists while the yeast came alive and the dough yielded under her knuckles as if the morning itself might rise because she asked it to. On the far bluff, the ruined stumps of last year's trees clung to the earth like broken teeth, and the bells of Natchez, thin, far, made a sound like metal cooled too quick. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. She pressed her thumb into the center of each roll, a private habit that made a small well like an eye. It was the mark she used when she wanted to tell herself a thing and remember it later. Today, do not forget the letters. The others knew it as a kitchen quirk, the way some cooks pinched dough. But in Eveline's mind, each well was a vowel. The rising bowl, O, lidded over with damp linen. The rack of cooling pans, E, lined like fence posts. She could hide entire words inside an ordinary morning and no one suspected the phrase taking shape, the little sentence she fed herself to stay alive. She had learned with grease rag and ash, not a primer. In nights that smelled of lye and river, when the world went down to a hush and the coals were sleeping eyes, she traced letters in the skillet's sheen until she knew the shapes by the way her fingers remembered them. A dropped scrap from a newspaper, Mr. Brathwaite's ledger left open an inch too wide, the gilt spine of the family Bible, they were all doors. She opened them with patience and only enough to look. If anyone asked why her gaze always slid like water over printed things, she had an answer ready. Pretty swirls. It was true, and it was not. The house belonged to Tolliver Brathwaite, who liked to speak his name like a proof. Tolliver, in his starch and boots, a man who believed the river turned because men like him asked it to bend. The house was not fine as some in Natchez proper, but set with a planter's vanity. Long brick walk, pale columns streaked already with mildew, a wind that moved through rooms like a hush in a church and made the drapes breathe. The fields belonged to him, the people too by his accounting, the babies not yet born and the dead the river took, all written in his ledger with steady, short strokes. The kitchen belonged to Eveline when the door shut behind her and the latch fell. Aunt Maria came in with her basket of herbs and a back that had carried more hours than any clock. "You countin' again," she said, which was not a question. "Dough don't mind it, think it likes to be watched. Dough like warmth and time, same as anything else breathing." Aunt Maria set her bundle on the table, unwrapped the damp cloth, and the room filled with the green, warm smell of what she had gathered. Sage, summer savory, a sprig of mint she coaxed out of the dry ditch with a cup of dishwater most evenings. Eveline saw the plant names in her mind as letters, the way the S curved in sage like a river bend, the stern stem of tea in mint. Behind the kitchen, the yard stacked into work. Boys with ash sticks beating rugs, Ruthie slapping sheets onto the line like taming wild birds, two little ones dragging a broken barrel hoop and calling it a wagon. On the far edge, Jonah in the smokehouse, a whip-thin man whose laughter sat deep, rolling out of him only when he found it necessary and not a breath sooner. Eveline watched him a moment. She knew the plane of his shoulder blades, the faded patch on his shirt where the cloth lifted clean of his back because a lash cut shallow there once, and then healed, and then cut again. She did not like that her mind kept count of such things without asking her permission, the way a careful woman in a market counts change by feel, even while she bargains. The counting had made a hard place under her ribs.
"Sharp morning," Jonah called through the open smokehouse door. "Fog thick as grits." "Fog like that hides boats," Eveline said, setting the rolls into the oven with a piece of salt pork fat wrapped in cloth for a glove. "And men." "Boats and men both trouble," Aunt Maria said. "Both got appetite." They fell into the work their bodies knew. Salt tightened meat on the hooks, scalded tomatoes blushed to a deeper red and slipped their skins like a thing unashamed. Coffee hissed into the pot. The house bell rang once, twice, insistence with a little impatience dressed inside it. Eveline did not flinch. She had learned to keep her hands moving and let the bell be a weather, something noted, not obeyed like a drum. The harvest was a proud one. The fields laid down like a blanket of gold most afternoons, and a dry spell at the right time to sweeten the cane. There had been rumors in the rows, men up in Vicksburg arguing, some preacher orator with a voice big as the riverbank, talk of free soil and sparks traveling the length of the country with breath enough to blow a house down. Eveline did not let herself turn her ear to rumor when knives needed sharpening and a pot had to be saved from a scorch. Yet letters from the world beyond the bend came through the kitchen anyway, stuck to the bottoms of crates or tucked into the hems of sacks of flour, the jag of a headline, a torn-off column, someone's neat "yours," and the last half of their name. She kept what she found and put it under the hearthstone with the blue bead she had once been given by a boatman for luck. Eveline had not always belonged to this house. She had been sold into it on a day made of dust. It had the feel of a story she refused to tell herself. When she washed the light from her eyes at night, she told herself other stories, how rivers decided things among themselves, how wind had a language and it might one day pass hers back to her, how a woman could make a door out of anything with hinges enough in her mind. That and the letters. They were small doors you could keep under your tongue. The day Jonas got the lash for letting a mule drag the plow through soft ground instead of turning the row was the day the hard place under Eveline's ribs turned to iron. She had seen whippings before, a public lesson meant to stick to all who watched, but this was a petty thing, done in the shade when no one of consequence would be bothered by the sight and done for show rather than any reason. The overseer, Collins, a man made mostly of hunger with a little tobacco to hold his shape, had a way of smiling when he did his work that made Eveline think of children pulling the wings off flies. Tolliver watched from the gallery with lemonade he did not drink, and when he found his fill, he turned away as if what happened in his yard was weather again. That night, the frog sang until the dark seemed to tremble with it, and in the kitchen the coals lay like the eyes of red foxes. Eveline wrote in the ashpan because she could not sleep. She wrote slowly so as not to lie to herself. D-O-O-R. The D lifted, the O breathed, the R bent its head like a woman ducking into hard rain. She rubbed the word out with her palm and wrote another. N-O. She did not rub that one away. She let it sit there until the ashes gray went cold. A harvest supper was coming, the excuse for neighbors to walk up the drive in their prettiest lies, for three fiddles to saw until the mosquitoes got drunk on the sweat behind people's knees and went to sleep, for Tolliver to boast about numbers and weather and Providence, which he always spoke to as if it were a polite guest on his porch. It would be food and more food, candles slicking everything with honey-colored light, toasts to the season, men laughing at things that were not funny. Lady Talk says Mrs. aimed to invite half the county, Ruthie said, picking chickens with quick fingers, feathers sticking to the sweat at her temples, says it ain't proper to sup alone on a year like this, says it ain't proper not to be seen. Proper is a word that mean expensive, means we gon' cook until the stars come loose, Aunt Maria said. Eveline nodded. The work did not frighten her. Fire and knives and time were a world she ruled. What frightened her was the edge she felt inside herself, the bright metal of a decision almost made. She did not think herself brave. She thought herself tired of being careful. She thought of Jonah's back. She thought of the girls in the washing yard who joked in voices too high to be laughter and full of the kind of hurt you pretend is a game. She thought of the ledger with Tolliver's hand like little fences, holdings, and the notion came to her not as an idea, but as a sound in her blood. No.
When the riverboat tied up that week with crates of late peaches and sacks of dry goods, Eveline went to the back where the boatmen sometimes let a woman trade kitchen suite for a look at the world's paper. She brought Johnny cakes hot off the griddle and a pot of coffee black enough to make a man honest. Baptiste, who had the river in his shoulders and teeth too white to look real, took the cakes and put a folded page on the barrelhead as if it had dropped by itself from the sky. He did not look at it. He did not look at her. She wiped the rim of the coffee pot and spoke to the page without touching it. What'd it say? Say Boston men talking like thunder, Baptiste said, lifting a shoulder. Say somebody name I can't say in my mouth, 'cause it catch on my teeth. Say there's a road in the dark if you walk it right. A road ain't a road if a body don't know where it go, she said. You got a river, he said. She know. He wiped the last of the cakes across his tongue and then set the skillet back on the board, not so much generous as exact. You careful, he said, like a prayer and a warning both. Eveline put the folded page under her apron and did not open it until she was back in the kitchen with the door barred and the kettle talking on the back eye. It was a newspaper not meant to be useful in a house like this. Words about men and buildings she would never see. Names like marble. But there was a map printed sideways to fit the page, arrows and towns along a coast she could not quite imagine. She understood none of it until she noticed the key in the corner. Small letters, ABC, telling a reader what meant what. That was all she needed. A key you could keep in your mouth. She copied the little A and the little B into the place behind her ear where she kept the shape of the kitchen and the yard and the way the field dipped near the fence where the land recalled a creek that used to live there. She thought a long time about what and whom she loved enough to risk losing. She thought a long time about where Mercy lived and whether it was a gate you could find or a spring you had to be born near. She looked at the calendar scratched onto the doorframe and Aunt Mariah's neat scallops, market days, planting, someone's birthday. And she put her finger on the evening of the harvest supper and felt the splinter in the wood press into her skin like a punctuation mark. She did not tell Jonah the first afternoon she decided. She did not tell Ruthie, nor Aunt Mariah, nor the boys who carried wood. She kept the deciding in her chest until it cooled enough to handle, and then she began to take one step after another in a way no one could see if they weren't looking where she looked. She moved the jars on the top shelf, vanilla behind cinnamon, sage behind mint, and the order sang a song in her mind only she could hear. She tied one string around another string and made a knot she would remember as a number. She set a spoon north of a plate when it ought to sit east and told herself that meant wait. She went to the yard and touched the fig tree, its leaves like a rough tongue, and told herself a fig is a mouth. It will speak when it is time. The fields got loud in the last week before the supper, men cutting cane in a rhythm that was a kind of prayer, women bringing water, the air bright with dust that had nowhere else to go. Tolliver came down the row once in a while on his horse and made remarks to the overseer as if work were a stranger he could recognize only by the clothes it wore. The missus sent lists down to the kitchen on a card embossed with her name, the E's proud and the S's asleep. Her name was Millicent, which Eveline had once thought a pretty sound until she learned how a person could rake their own name like a garden every morning and still grow nothing in it but cold. Millicent came into the kitchen 2 days before the supper because she liked to do that when she could dress her curiosity as generosity. You'll need another hand, she said from behind the fan she always held as if the air owed her favors. I'm sending Cora down, and the small one, what's her name? Issa. Isaiah, ma'am, because Issa was a boy, and boys were always in danger of being mistaken for something else and punished for disappointing someone's idea. Isaiah, Millicent repeated, as if she were telling a story to which she had not been introduced. He'll do for turning the spit. Eveline smiled the kitchen smile that lived at the edges of her mouth and did not go deeper. Yes, ma'am.
Cora was 14 and knew only too well how to be useful when somebody watched. Isaiah was 11 and quick, with a way of putting his whole weight into whatever he was asked to do, as if he thought he could outrun the job by finishing it in one breath. Eveline set him at the spit and showed him how to pace himself, the way the big roast likes even turning, like a man in a dance who will trip if he thinks about his feet too much. She put Cora at the cooling table to trim tarts and keep flies off custard with a branch of willow fanned slow. "Miss Eveline," Isaiah said, eyes on the meat and hands where she told him to keep them, "you think you ever gonna see the place the river start?" "That a baby question," Cora said, pleased to know something and to be beside someone who knew everything. "Rivers don't start nowhere, they everywhere all at once." Eveline laughed, quick and small. "They start where rain remember itself. They start where a hill is small enough to be invited to lie down. They start where two little lines on a map hold hands. But the place a river starts ain't the place everyone call its name." Isaiah nodded, as if he understood. And maybe he did. A boy who already knew how a thing could start deep inside somebody else's house, and you still wear the consequence as if you asked for it. That night, when the lantern burned low, Eveline took the blue bead from under the hearthstone and rolled it between finger and thumb until its cool was the kind you could keep. She remembered the boatman's voice, "You careful." And she answered him inside herself, "I will be careful where I can, and where I cannot, I will be exact." She did not name what she would do, not even to God, not even in the quiet between heartbeats. She talked instead about water and time and the hunger of men who call their wanting righteous. She talked about the weight of a ledger drawn shut. She talked about the thread of her own life, how it had a knot she could not tie any tighter and perhaps could only cut. Morning came with the smell of cane cooking somewhere in the county, a rich, almost dark scent that made the kitchen feel sweet along its edges. Eveline set to the work of making a feast that would make men praise themselves for having taste. She peeled and pitted and whipped and stirred. She salted and unsalted and let butter go just to the edge of brown before whispering it back. She made gravies that looked like velvet. She cut biscuits so even it made Ruthie laugh. "You a clock with soft hands," Ruthie said, admiring and a little afraid of perfection. "Soft hands burn same as any," Eveline said, and pulled the pan with a practiced flick. In the middle of it all, Tulliver brought a man through the kitchen to show off his industry. He liked to display the heart of things the way a boy shows a frog heart in a jar. "This is where we turn muscle into culture," he said, grinning at his cleverness. The man with him was thick around the middle and carried his laugh in front of him like a tray. He asked how many birds it would take to feed the neighbors on a night like the one Tulliver promised. He asked if the women could be trusted not to taste more than was polite. He asked whether spiced did not mean spoiled sometimes. Eveline let the word slip past her like minnows. She looked at the man's hands, soft, rings, and the line at Tulliver's temple where the skin had learned to pinch itself around a frown he probably thought was authority. She watched how a fly landed on his lip and he did not notice. She understood then something that made her calmer than she had been in days. Men like this did not see the hands that fed them, not really. If they did, it was as spoons. That evening she went out to the edge of the yard where the fig tree stood, like a woman with her skirts spread to shade children. The figs were late but heavy, purple where they had been green, their insides the color of secrets. Eveline touched one, and it opened under her fingers as if it had been holding its breath for her. She brought a basketful back to the kitchen and set them to roasting with a little sugar until they looked like small suns in eclipse. The smell of them climbed into the ceiling and lingered among the smoke like a sermon. "Figs speak?" Isaiah asked, because he heard everything she ever said to anything and saved it to see if it might be true later. "They do," she said. "They say, now." On the morning of the supper, the air wore a thin gold. The fields looked tired as if they meant to sleep standing up. Eveline woke before the bell because her body had rung one of its own deep in her bones. She set pots to boil and meat to warm and bread to rise. She boiled cloths and set clean basins in a row for washing hands because Millicent liked the show of hygiene more than the thing itself. She checked the knives twice. Aunt Mariah moved through the kitchen, naming the day. "Company Day," she said, putting down pickles made in August that had waited their turn like people in a pew. "Eyes Day," she said, setting out candles. "Luck Day," she said, touching the jamb of the door with her thumb and then touching her own hip where she kept a little pouch of tobacco and dried leaves for protection. Eveline picked up the pouch and pressed it back into Aunt Mariah's palm. "Keep it close," she said. "You too," Aunt Mariah said. Her gaze was steady. "You look like you got a river in your mouth." "Got a song," Eveline said. It was the truth. Neighbors arrived like birds at a field that had learned to act ripe just to be left alone. Bonnets and boots, waistcoats and giggles. The fiddles tuned and then tuned again, which was a worse sound than a cat being taught manners. The yard filled with the particular music of people who know they are being watched and enjoy it, the way laughter lifts high, the way men hold their chests, the way girls look down with their eyes tethered to looking up. Millicent came into the kitchen to supervise the procession of dishes as if she had cooked the hour out of every one of them herself. "The trout," she said, "the succotash, the good bread, not the daily, the roast, the relish, no, not that one yet." She flicked a hand as if flipping a page.
"Yes, ma'am," Eveline said, which was something you said to paper as much as to a person sometimes. She set her plates on the big pine table and arranged them to a geometry no one but her would see. The roast center, the trout to the left, the sides like compass points. She wiped rims with a cloth that had never seen anything else but this work. She let the figs wait. By dusk, the sky had a bruise like the morning's but deeper, and the lanterns made the yard into a place cut from all other places. People talked louder because the day was leaving them, and they were not ready to let it go without a good performance of owning it. Tolliver stood with one foot on the lower step of the porch, as if he had climbed his own house and deserved a medal for it. He lifted his glass, and the room, yard, porch, house, kitchen, took a breath, and made a circle around the sound of him. "Friends," he said, "neighbors, the Lord has smiled on us." He glanced toward the fields as if the Lord were busy standing in the dark there, counting stalks. "We have cause?" Eveline did not listen. She did not need to hear how a man dressed the day to know what it meant. She listened for other things. The sound the river made when wind fell off it into the cane. The slip of a shoe over dirt. The way women in the shadows of the porch set their fans to the same rhythm without intending to. She heard the quick breath of Cora when someone laughed too loud near her. She heard Isaiah keep the spit turning, even though he was standing now, sneaking looks through the crack in the door to see the lanterns. Jonah passed the kitchen door on his way to the yard, and his eye caught hers. It was a moment as small as a coin, exchanged without remark. He had not asked, and she had not told, but they had held the same sentence between them for days now, like a man and a woman carry a bucket together on a pole and feel each other's weight in the sway of the water. She set the figs into their bowl, and the glaze lay over them like a night river. She took a breath deep enough to remember her own name if anyone tried to take it. Then she began to carry plates to the side table on the porch where they would be arranged and blessed by Tolliver's hand before being sent to the long table where the neighbors sat. The porch boards creaked in a rhythm she knew by heart. First step, complains. Second, sighs. Third, steady. And she adjusted her weight to give the first two kindness. Millicent was a queen on her throne of wicker near the door. "No, not that yet," she murmured, and lifted a finger toward the figs. "After the toasts." "Yes, ma'am." Eveline set the bowl on the little table and waited. She felt the night like a shawl thrown around her shoulders by a careful hand. She felt the hard place under her ribs turn bright, and then dark, and then bright again. She looked at the neighbors' faces the way hunger and pleasure arranged them into almost identical expressions. She thought of the word key.
How keys fit into things, how a hand had to be steady or the teeth would scrape and tell on you. Tolliver boasted the way men boast when their houses are listening. The fiddles sawed a tune that had been alive longer than any person there. Children ran the way they do when grown people are talking and think the sound shields them. Plates set down, plates lifted, glasses grinned in the lamplight. The evening opened its coat and showed its throat. "Now," Millicent said, delicate fingers reaching, "the figs." Eveline lifted the bowl. It was heavy the way a baby is heavy, living weight. She carried it out like an offering and set it where she was told to set it. She stepped back. She waited. The sound of the river folded around the yard and came across the porch like a breath. She watched Tolliver's hand. He reached for a fig as if he were doing something holy. He grinned with his mouth and not his eyes. He raised it, and a neighbor beside him did the same, and another, until the porch looked like some old painting where fruit stands in for mercy. Millicent watched with a satisfaction she did not earn. Jonah leaned in the doorway near the yard with his shoulder resting on the frame as if the wood needed a friend. And then Millicent turned her head and said a simple thing that made the world turn a single degree in a way Eveline had not planned for. "Eveline, do be a dear and taste one for me. You know how guests can be. Skittish. So much talk in the county about, well, go on." Her smile was sweet as lie. The yard did a small private thing, a hush no one would recall in words later, but it happened. The fiddles kept on like stubborn men. Tolliver laughed as if Millicent had made a clever joke about caution and women and trust. Eveline felt the river in her mouth again, a taste like iron on a cracked lip. She reached for the bowl. Her hand was steady. She had known a moment like this might come. She had counted to it quietly in the early hours when the ashpan said no, and the blue bead cooled her skin. She had laid out a path in a world that paths love to lie. Still, the air now had the smell of lightning, even though the sky was dry, and her heart knocked once on the inside of her ribs as if to ask to be let in somewhere safer. She chose a fig. It lay in her palm like a heart. The glaze clung to it the way memory clings to places you wish it would leave. She lifted it toward her mouth and saw, beyond the porch light, Isaiah's face tilted in the crack of the door, his eyes two dark coins, his mouth a little round of a child who has realized a thing is bigger than a story. She saw Jonah's jaw go still. She saw Aunt Mariah's hands lift and then rest in her lap again, like she was laying a blanket over someone sleeping. Eveline brought the fig to her lips. The room, the porch, the yard, the river, all leaned toward her the way a field leans to a storm it can smell, but not see. The fig's skin touched. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Touched, but only the glaze, a shine no thicker than breath. Eveline let the syrup wet her lip while her teeth stayed closed, a mannerly pantomime drilled by a lifetime of being watched. Then she tipped her wrist the smallest fraction and let the fruit slip back into the bowl as if it had been too slick to hold. A murmur of polite laughter washed the porch, the sort that forgives a servant for being human when it costs nothing to be generous. "Delicious," she said, and the word was steady as a plate. "Sir?" She offered the bowl to Tolliver. He plucked his prize. Others followed, eager to be seen as unafraid. The neighbors' fingers, rings, bitten nails, pale crescents, sank into the soft skins, and the porch filled with the gentle, obscene sound of fruit being broken open and praised. Eveline stepped backward into the doorway shadow. She lifted her chin once toward Jonah. It was nothing. It was everything. The glaze had been cooked twice and strained once and cooled in a bowl no one would choose among a table of bowls if they had never worked in this kitchen. She had made 2 glazes that afternoon, alike as cousins, until you knew them. One was sugar and warmth and a memory of wine. The other carried a different memory, something old and bitter lifted from a kernel you would never crack for sweetness, something boiled and boiled again until it forgot its name and kept only its work. She had not touched the second glaze with her bare hands. She had not breathed it long. She had done the arithmetic by scent and time, the way you count to 10 without moving your lips at a child who is about to run into the road. She had set that glaze aside for only the bowl that would find its way to the porch and into the mouths that believed kitchens existed to applaud them. She did not watch them chew. She watched the river. In the space between pull and swallow, the wind came off the water with a rumor of rain that had not made up its mind. Millicent dabbed a corner of her mouth and declared the figs precisely the thing for an evening like this. The fiddles ran their bow hair thin. Sparks lifted from the kitchen chimney and went up into the dark like a flock of tiny birds deciding whether to migrate. Eveline took the empty tray from the table and slipped back into her room of heat and iron. Cora's hands were anxious at the custards. Isaiah's spit turned and turned. Aunt Mariah's mouth was a firm line around the long spoon that kept the gravy from catching. In that small republic, Eveline was the weather and the law. She set the tray on its nail, looked once at each face, and gave no speech. There is a time when words spend courage you need to save for the body. She said, "Steady." It was enough. They understood steady meant everything. Breath, voice, pace of foot, the angle of an eye if someone pointed a question at you like a knife. The porch held a few beats longer like an animal trying not to show it was wounded. The first change came as a hiccup in Tolliver's laugh. He put a hand to his stomach and stiffened, the way a man does when he refuses to let anything inside him be interpreted as weakness. He drank water. He lifted his glass too bold and let the ice clack his teeth. Across from him, Mr. Lacey, neighbor, loud, fond of telling long jokes with holes in them, cleared his throat as if something had climbed it the wrong way. He pushed his chair back, and the front legs caught on the porch board. The sound was a small scream he grinned at. "Guts," he said, one word too honest for the company he kept. Millicent fluttered her fan. "Gentlemen," she scolded lightly. "We have ladies."
"Then let the ladies look away," Mr. Lacey said, trying for a jest and landing in a gurgle. Sweat came up on Tolliver's forehead, fine as flour. A man at the far end of the table leaned hard against his neighbor, as if to share a secret, and then stayed there. Dead weight a person cannot politely shift. The yard made the smallest music of confusion, the way dogs in a town begin to bark at different moons. A few women stood, unsure whether to call for salts or servants or their god. The fiddles staggered, their tune trying to remember its legs. In the kitchen, a gnat drifted into the heat above the stove and vanished like a thought that will not be finished. "Hold," Eveline said quietly to Cora, whose eyes were on the doorway as if a crowd might come ask the custards to choose sides. Jonah appeared in the threshold, with his shoulder deeper into the frame now, as if he needed the wood to confirm his outline. He did not speak. He moved his eyes, porch, yard, faces, and then he moved them to Eveline and let them stay. He had that gift of not blinking when a thing required witness. Outside, Tolliver tried to speak, and his jaw forgot him. His tongue worked as if it had to recall what mouths were assigned to do. He pushed himself up and the world tilted. Millicent caught his sleeve and then let go the instant she calculated the optics of clinging. Mr. Collins, the overseer, pushed through the tangle, grim authority on his face, and took hold of Tolliver as if dragging a recalcitrant mule. He had eaten only one fig, and then two, and then another, greedy as always when he thought a thing was free. Now his own belly made a hard knot under his vest. "What is this?" he managed, spit white at the corner of his mouth. No one in the yard had a word sharp enough to cut through the alarm that was rising like steam. People called to the names they believe are in charge when their bodies remind them they are animals. "Tolliver, Mr. Brathwaite, Collins, somebody!" The names fluttered, landed nowhere, lifted again. Millicent's voice, pure and thin as a flute, pierced it. "Kitchen," she said. "Fetch." She did not finish the sentence because she did not know the name of what she wanted. The particular bottle, the too late prayer, the past made different. She turned into the doorway and stopped. Eveline stood there with the light behind her like a crown the chimney made out of smoke. Aunt Mariah set her spoon down the way a woman folds a shroud. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Cora held a fly switch, her hand steady as if she had been told to pick up a newborn and never set it down again. Isaiah's hands turned the spit. Millicent's eyes took Eveline in as if for the first time, not as a utensil, but as a person inconveniently present. She opened her mouth. All the words Eveline had ever been called lined up behind Millicent's teeth, practicing the order in which they would come out. Eveline spoke first. "Ma'am," she said, "you want cool cloths, shade, space enough for air." She said it like a recipe. Millicent's lips trembled into the shape of a command that never arrived. She swallowed it and pivoted back to the yard, thin shoes smart on the porch boards. "Bring them in," she told nobody in particular. He needs... What he needs ain't in this house, nor in this county. Eveline did not answer. She moved. She put a basin on the table and another on the floor. She stacked clean cloths. She sent Cora to the pump for water so cold it would make a man's mouth curse and his skin give thanks. She lifted Isaiah's hands off the spit and put them on the basin. "You count to 20 slow, and then you bring it back to the fire," she told him. "Say your numbers inside. Don't lend them to no one." He nodded, lip caught in his teeth. They brought Tolliver in like a statue that had lost its pedestal. Men tried to keep him from showing them what he was made of. His boots dragged, marking the pine with scuffs that would not sand out. He groaned a wordless thing and then found some consonants. "Doctor, where's... Damn you, Collins. Sent..." Collins staggered, mouth wet. He tried to stand like an overseer when his own legs were negotiating separate contracts with gravity. "Get the... Eveline," he barked, reflex pointing his tongue to the one place authority still believed it could land. "What did you..." "What I always do," she said, and handed him a cloth folded like an apology. He took it without meaning to, pressed it to his belly where pride had been living rent-free, and made a sound like a saw meeting a knot. Neighbors followed, some leaning on their own courage, some running from the sight of themselves and other people's trouble. A young woman in plum silk collapsed into a chair and breathed too fast. Her husband patted her wrist, as if her pulse were a misbehaving lapdog. Mr. Lacey fell to his knees, not in prayer, but because the floor surprised him by being too sudden. The room filled with the smell of fear, which is not unlike the smell of onions when they hit a hot pan, honest and not to be hidden. People who had never said Eveline's name said it now, some with pleading, some with demand, as if the kitchen held a trap door the mistress had forgotten to lock. Eveline worked as if to save them. She cooled foreheads. She loosened collars with the same hands that had tied aprons and trussed roasts. She said, "Breathe," to men who did not know they had been holding their air hostage. She kept her eyes moving like a woman at a river crossing who cannot afford to look down at the water more than once. And yet, even as she bent to them, a cord ran from her spine to the door, from the door to the yard, from the yard to the dark, where the river kept the rest of its promises. She felt Jonah at her back like a wall. She felt Aunt Mariah's prayer, wordless, the old tongue that never needed a book to learn it. She felt Korah return with water that smoked in the basin from its own cold. She felt Isaiah counting, his whisper a rope he refused to let go. "Doctor!" someone cried from the porch, the word flung into the night like a hat. Down the lane, a lantern bobbed. Mr. Farley, the barber, who called himself a surgeon when blood needed an excuse. Behind him, the real doctor's boy ran with a satchel that made a brave shape against his ribs. The boy arrived first, pale with the righteousness of usefulness. He pushed through to Tolliver with the sureness of someone who has been taught that rooms will part for him. Eveline stepped back to give him space. He opened his bag and took out a bottle with a label he did not understand and a spoon flat as a tongue. He tasted the air like a hound. "Something's wrong," he said, astonished to be living in a world where things could be wrong without his permission. Mr. Farley caught up and began to perform his expertise. Pulse taken, declarations made, instructions to loosen garments delivered with the gravity of a man practicing to be a statue in a public square. "Something they ate," he pronounced, having looked at nothing long enough to be sure his authority remained his. "Spoiled fruit, perhaps, or wine turned sorry. We must purge." He called for mustard and water. He called for vinegar. He called for God. He did not call for Eveline. And yet every request had to pass through her hands to become action. She ladled, measured, cooled, wrung, and every motion wrote a line inside her. Now, now. She did not know how many would die. She had never pretended to control the math of a night once begun. What she had done with a clean count and a steady flame, and an eye toward the ledger where her life had been a column written in someone else's hand. She had not meant to take the whole county to the river. She had meant to end a house. Mr. Lacey retched and failed to find relief. A neighbor named Reed clutched his middle and asked meekly for his mother as if she still lived and the word alone could be a bridge. Millicent stood rigid, her fan at last still, and watched her husband's color move through a poor painter's palette. Pink, ash, bruise. She looked at Eveline only once more, and in that glance was a world of comprehension too late. "Do something," Millicent said softly. It was not command any longer. It was thin hope, tied to the wrong stake. "I am," Eveline said. Outside, thunder talked to the horizon without making any promises. The first drops winked in the dust like eyes that choose when to open. Jonah stepped so close his shirt brushed her sleeve. "When?" he asked, his voice a stone in water. "When the doctor says the word he thinks is remedy," she said. It came. It always comes. Men like Farley carry the cure they trust inside them, a ritual, more than a result. "Purge," he said again, sonorous, as if the room had not heard him the first time. Eveline nodded once to Jonah. He melted backward into the yard, a shadow returning to the dark that taught it. Aunt Mariah pressed Cora's hand and put it on the handle of the kitchen door. "When Miss says," she whispered, and Cora's chin dipped, fierce. Eveline stepped to Millicent then, close enough to smell the violet water in her hair. "Ma'am," she said, the old word polished for this last use. "The basement is cool. Put men there who can't keep air. The porch is too warm." Millicent blinked as if the world had changed the alphabet without telling her. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder to anyone who still obeyed that voice. "The cellar! Move them! Now!" In the churn, rooms forgot their rules. Men carried men,
Women forgot to be decorative and became animal again, as strong as they have ever been. The doctor was pleased to be directing traffic into the bowels of a house. The optics of command steadied his hands. People who felt well enough to judge leaned against door frames and judged. People who did not bowed their heads to a bowl. In the tide of it, Eveline slid out the back with Cora and Isaiah on her shadow. Aunt Mariah went last, pausing only to lift her pouch from its peg. The rain increased, small needles sewing the dark to itself. The smokehouse wore a ring of wet earth at its base like a halo that had fallen and learned to be practical. Jonah stood at the yard's edge under the fig, a figure cut from the night. Beyond him, two more figures unhooked themselves from deeper shade. Men from the quarter who understood a sentence without hearing it spoken. One held a coil of rope, the other a sack. The rope man's face was set to tomorrow. The sack man's eyes were on the house as if waiting for it to admit what it was. "Boatman?" Eveline asked.
"Baptiste," Jonah said, "down where the cane kisses the mud. Says the river's mouth is open if we get there with the name on our breath." "Then we bring the names," she said. She put a hand on Cora's shoulder and another on Isaiah's head, as if to count them by touch. "We move quiet. We do not stop for anything that calls us pretty or wicked. We keep our feet." Behind them, a man in the cellar found the last precipice his body had to offer and went over it. His wife's voice rose, a torn ring. Millicent's call answered in an octave no one there had ever heard her use. Mr. Farley, certain now of the nobility of suffering when performed indoors, demanded more candles. Eveline moved. The cane held its breath for them and then sighed, closing the slit they left behind. Bare feet and mud make a sound like secrets agreeing. Jonah's hand found hers once in the dark where the path dipped, and he did not squeeze, only confirmed. They stepped through a place where frogs wrote scripture, and a place where the earth had sunk a little in the shape of something that once lay there longer than it should have. Isaiah stumbled and caught himself on Eveline's skirt, and she did not shake him off. She let him balance on the fact of her, and then gave him back to his own legs. At the lower bend, the river leaned toward them with its great shoulder. Baptiste's boat was a deeper dark moored to a stump that remembered being a tree. He rose from it the way a man rises from a bed that is too small for his long body. "I count 8, he said, voice more mathematics than greeting. "You bring more?" "Some coming behind," Jonah said. Indeed, there were shapes in the cane with breath, where breath had no business making sound if a person wanted to be counted as safe. A woman with a baby swaddled into silence. A boy with a scythe he would not put down, even though night had no grass for him to cut. An old man with a hat he touched when he saw Eveline, as if she had always been the thing I had acknowledged. Baptiste nodded. He had very little language for ceremony. Work burned it out of a man. He put a palm to the gunwale. "We go in 2 cuts or 3, river high with its own mind." Eveline looked back once. The house was a cluster of windows, shaking lamplight into the rain like coins begged from a poor god. She did not wish any more death than she had made. The night would do what it would do with the bodies inside. Her work now had changed, not the ending of a ledger, but the beginning of a list. "First boat," she said. "Children, old, and those who cannot keep their feet." She did not have to lift her voice. People who had run out of choices hear soft words louder than shouts. Isaiah hesitated when his foot touched the boat. "Miss Eveline," he whispered. "You coming?" "I will be the last that leaves," she said. "You will be the first that arrives." She put her palm on his cheek and drew a circle there, a letter only they would remember. The boat settled with the weight of new lives. Baptiste pushed off with a pole that had learned the bottom of this part of the river by heart. The shush of water against wood erased their names behind them and promised to keep what it had taken. The night accepted them the way a cloak accepts a shoulder. Back at the yard, a voice shot through the dark like an arrow. "Stop! Stop them!" Collins, staggering but alive, had found his feet and his fury. 2 men with guns came behind him, one of them more afraid of the night than of disobedience. The other decided to be a story for himself later.
They crashed through Cain like pigs through a fence. Jonah went toward them without hurry. He did not carry a weapon a white man would recognize. He carried rope. He let the first man rush him and then showed him what rope ties faster than anger. The second stopped short on the kind of surprise that finds only men who have never been required to learn what their hands can do without a trigger. He raised his gun and found Aunt Mariah in front of him, which confused him entirely. He forgot to decide whether he had ever shot a grandmother. She laid 2 fingers on his wrist and spoke in a voice that grew in another country. He lowered the gun because some part of him remembered being somebody's child. "Collins," he shouted, salvage in the shout. "They got witches!" "Fool," Collins snapped, but the word bent on itself. Sweat painted his face in delicate lines that would have been jewelry if the light loved him. He lifted his gun, and the dark gave it back a dozen times.
Eveline stepped between him and the river. She did not lift her hands. She did not need to. The night seemed to lift them for her and set them at her sides like 2 open doors. "You," Collins said. He had always preferred naming to understanding. "What you taught us," she said. "To finish the work we start, to set a table and clear it." He steadied his aim. "You'll hang for this." He meant it to be prophecy. It was only grammar. "Almost everything I ever done, I done with a rope near," she said. "Ain't never been yours to teach me fear." Behind her, the boat whispered away with its cargo. In front of her, the rain slanted like a curtain drawn across a stage. Collins took a step, and then another. Jonah was a shadow at her right shoulder. Cora, at her left, held nothing, but did not look like emptiness. Aunt Mariah had become taller than any of them, and that was a trick only the old learn. The shot came, because the dark always contains at least one. It found a tree, a shrug of dirt, a memory. Eveline did not flinch. She felt the river lift under her ribs, an old animal making itself big before a bear. She spoke and did not know until she heard it that her voice would make of itself a bell. "We leaving," she said. "The rest is yours." Collins lifted his gun again and met not Eveline's eyes, but his own, reflected oddly in the wet barrel. In that stammer of hesitation lived a lifetime of other people's pain, and in it also lived a small chance. Jonah stepped into that space and took the gun. He did not do violence to Collins. Violence had already been Collins's chosen home. He removed the instrument like a mother removing a pin from a baby's mouth. "Walk away," Jonah told him, "if you can." And that became the final insult. Collins tried to spit and made only foam. He swung his fist and found nobody had elected to keep standing where he expected them to be. He fell. The night made of him another wet shape. He began to laugh, a thin, torn sound, and kept laughing until it gave out. They moved. Boats left and returned, bellies low in the water and then relieved. Baptiste's shoulders shone with a quiet purpose. The river hummed the song it hums when it agrees not to tell on you. The last boat took the last of the children, and the last of the old, and the last of the women who could not run anymore. Eveline stood in the shallow and held the gunwale steady while the boat decided whether to accept one more life. "Get in," Baptiste said. "We leave the house to count itself." She did not. Not yet. She turned and looked up the hill. The windows were fewer now, some gone to dark where candles had burned themselves foolish. Millicent was a shape on the porch, a pale moth pinned to weather. She had not left Tolliver because love is one of the stranger prisons. The doctor's boy ran across the yard with something that thought it could help, and couldn't. Mr. Farley's voice carried like a bad sermon. Eveline put her hand to her mouth and bit her knuckle and then released it. She wanted to know whether her work was exact or cruel, whether the math had been right-sized. She wanted to know if anyone whose life had not needed ending would live.
But the river pulled at her ankle with the insistence of a child saying your name for the third time, and she remembered that some answers are only another way of staying, when staying is a word for drowning. She stepped into the boat. It rocked and then accepted her. Jonah jumped in after, sure in his weight. Aunt Mariah sat like a queen who remembers where the throne came from. Cora pressed her shoulder against Evelyn's and whispered, "I ain't never felt my name so big." Isaiah, in the other boat now tied astern, lifted his hand, and she lifted hers back, and the space between them agreed to call itself a bridge for as long as necessary. They bent into the current. Baptista's pole found the bottom, and then the bottom let go. The boat slipped past the cane and the stump, and the place where the bank had fallen in last spring like a house forgetting a step. Night held them. The rain forgot them. The frogs took up again the verses they had dropped. For a long time no one spoke. Then, as the river widened and the land on either side pretended not to know them, Aunt Mariah began to hum, and the hum resolved into a tune with no words. The children slept against their mother's ribs. The old man's hat kept its crown above the wet as if it cared to count dignity as a thing that could float. Cora whispered letters, O, I, E, making small wells in the air with her finger, and Evelyn smiled because her secret had chosen a daughter without asking permission.
"Where?" Baptiste finally said, not looking back. He had learned not to give his eyes to questions that did not need them. "These waters got many mouths. Some swallow and don't spit. Some spit you into a place to call you property again." Eveline thought of the crooked map on the smudged newspaper, the key in the corner with its little letters for what meant what. She thought of the bend where the cane broke in the creek that used to live there. She thought of the faces in the boats, their breaths like soft flags in the dark. "Where rain remember itself," she said, and he grunted approval because he was a man who could use poetry if it came with a compass sewn into it. They made for a parish where the sheriff owed a debt to a man who owed a debt to another, whose grandmother had been saved in a yellow fever summer by a woman who looked like Aunt Mariah. They made for a priest who had, years ago, learned to mispronounce names in a way that made papers think they were different people. They made for a dock Baptiste knew where men with hats pulled low traded barrels with labels that said one thing and held another. They made for a night not on any calendar Tolliver had hung. The first boat scuffed wood on wood, and a hand reached out of the dark and caught the rope. "You cut it close," the hand said, and the voice it belonged to carried the fatigue of a man who freights freedom for a living. "Hurry, Dawn got long fingers." They hurried, which to the untrained eye still looks like stillness because quiet is part of speed. Feet touched planks and then dirt and then a floor that had pretended to be a storage room since before christenings. Children were laid on quilts washed thin by old prayers. The old man's hat came off and he held it to his chest and said nothing out loud because it would not have fit through his teeth. Isaiah found a corner and slept the way boys sleep when someone posts a guard on their dreams. Eveline did not lie down. She stood in a little square of dark and let her hand shake until they had spent it all. Jonah came and leaned the back of his head against the same wall, shoulder to shoulder but not touching and touching all the same. "You done it," he said. It was not praise. It was inventory. "What did I do?" she asked. She did not mean to sound like a child. She meant to be exact. "You took a word that lived between your ribs and made it a door. You walked through and dragged the hinge after." She closed her eyes and saw the porch again, the figs like small hearts, Tolliver laughing one last time and finding nothing behind it. She saw Millicent's face at the door like a sheet a storm had pressed flat against glass.
She saw Collins crumpled in the yard, laughter failing him as finally as breath. She saw the ledger in the study where a candle burned low without supervision. "We ain't done," she said. "No," Jonah said, "but we ain't owned." They moved again when the sky began to gray. They took a wagon with a false bottom, and the old man sat on it like he had been born to boredom, and boredom is a better disguise than most lies. They crossed a narrow bridge while men in uniform pretended to notice less than they could. They became 3 families going to see a cousin, and then 2 cousins coming home with a basket to help with a birth, and then 1 widow looking for a decent price on salt. At each telling, Eveline found the letter that needed changing and changed it without wincing at her own skill. At a crossroad where a sycamore had died and refused to fall, Baptiste left them. He touched the brim of no hat and said, "Water to you," and she answered, "Water," and both understood it meant more than thirst. They rode and walked and stood and waited and moved again. They traded names the way you trade coins in a market where the sheriff watches from a chair but pretends to sleep. They ate when eating did not cost them minutes. They did not light fires. They carried children whose weight got into bone and then became its own kind of strength. Cora learned to speak without moving her mouth in a way that made Isaiah laugh when laughter was safe and swallow it when laughter would echo. News came sideways, as it always does. A woman at a pump said a house on the Braithwaite Road had taken ill at a party. Such a shame, such a thing to happen to decent people. A man at a depot said the doctor worked like a saint and some lived and some didn't, and for once the dead had worn better clothes than the living. A boy with a basket of eggs said the overseer had lost his mind for a while and then found enough of it to leave. Eveline listened and let the words sort themselves. She asked no questions that would hook attention. At last, in a parish whose name curled in the mouth like molasses, they came to a pocket of ground that recognized them. The priest with the bad memory of vowels led them through the sacristy to a shed that smelled of rope and righteousness. A woman with strong wrists and a mouth that had never learned how to be small took Cora by the chin and said, "You are mine until you have your own," and Cora nodded without pretending to like or dislike it because she understood what was being offered. A boy with hands already taught to mend shoes looked at Isaiah's feet and said, "You'll do." And Isaiah grinned at the insult and accepted it as an apprenticeship.
Aunt Mariah sat on a stool and took her pouch out and set it on the floor in front of her. "I got names," she said. "They my children's and my mother's and the ones I stole out of the mouths of women who died before they could tell them." She poured them into the sawdust as if planting would do. The priest bowed his head because he was smart enough to know this was religion, if anything was. Eveline stood outside and looked at the sky that had not belonged to anyone all along, and now confessed it. Jonah came to stand beside her, and they breathed together, the way people do when they have reached a bank and are trying to convince their lungs they could trust it. "You could be going tomorrow," he said. "North, a boat, a paper that turns you into someone nobody can buy." "I could," she said. She thought of letters and keys and maps. She thought of the girls at the washing yard on Braithwaite land, laughter too high to be laughter. She thought of Millicent's face, and the fact that even pity for a woman like that was a luxury she could not afford to carry in her pocket where it might wear a hole. "What you want?" Jonah asked. "To learn other people to read," she said simply. "To put the small doors in their mouths. To make more hands that can open a day." She looked at her palms. "And to cook a meal that doesn't keep count." Jonah smiled, slow, the way a man smiles at rain in a dry month. "Then that's tomorrow." Tomorrow came wearing work clothes. She taught Cora first because Cora had already learned the patience of the fly switch, and patience is the spine of reading. Isaiah learned alongside his apprenticeship, moving his lips over letters while mending soles, and once he looked up with a nail in his fingers and said, "This word walk,"
And Evelyn laughed, because he had understood not just the one in front of him, but all the ones behind it. More came, women and men who had relocated the center of their bodies in order to carry a life not yet titled. Children whose names were rumors of saints. Old ones who had decided their bones could learn new alphabets if stubbornness helped. Evelyn wrote with chalk on a board someone had put aside because it did not fit a space any longer. She taught by recipe and by hymn, by ledger and by letter to a cousin that would never be sent. She taught by fig and by river. She taught yes and no and door. She taught the shape of the name a person gives themselves, which differs from the shape other people put over you like a coffin too soon. Word moved south and upriver, and along roads men in uniforms were beginning to consider their own by right. Men who did not mean to set a world free were preparing to argue about it anyway. Evelyn kept her head down and her eyes level. She did not tell stories about the night of the harvest supper unless a person had earned it by bringing a child to her with a question in the child's mouth she could not refuse. One afternoon, a figure appeared in the churchyard that made her body recall a porch without intending. Millicent stood where the fence had broken years ago and had been mended by attention instead of lumber. She wore a traveling dress that had given up where pride usually insists, and her fan hung from its loop like an old habit. She looked smaller, or perhaps Evelyn had become as large as her name demanded. They regarded each other. Birds made of plain brown chirped purely because they had nothing to sell. Millicent stepped forward, as if crossing water she did not trust. "You," she said, a word that meant many things, and now meant none of them well. Evelyn waited. "I came to say there were those who lived, and those who did not. My husband." She closed her eyes briefly, as if the light hurt, and then opened them again with effort. "He died." Evelyn neither smiled nor frowned. She let the fact be a fact. "And you?" "Alive," Millicent said. "Apparently. Though I am learning that word has many meanings." She looked at Evelyn's hands, perhaps hoping to find there the etiquette for this moment. "Did you—" She stopped. "No. Do not teach me to ask a question whose answer would require me to become another person to live with it." "Then what you want from me?" Evelyn asked. It was not unkind. Millicent lifted her chin the way a woman lifts it when every other part of her has been instructed to drop. "A name," she said. "I came to ask what name you would like placed in the notice. They will write something, you know. They always do. I thought, perhaps this time, since I am not a complete fool, I might ask the one who owns the story." Eveline tasted a laugh and did not spend it. She thought of the blue bead, the ash pan, the map, the door frame with its scallops, the fig turning itself open because she had touched it. She thought of the children at their slates and the old man walking upright without a hat for once because he had decided the sky could recognize him without one. She thought of Jonah sleeping on his back because no whip lived behind him now, and Aunt Mariah sitting in a chair with a back that caught her. "I got more names than you got paper," Eveline said gently. "But the one you can write is the one I gave myself to get here. Write Eveline. Write Natchez after it if you like the look of that. Write nothing else that tells a man where to aim his wanton." Millicent nodded. "Eveline of Natchez," she repeated, tasting it and trying not to make it delicate. "It has a shape." "All names do," Eveline said. "Some cut, some stitch." Millicent swallowed. "I have a ledger," she said, words choosing their path with care. "It does not balance any longer. I am learning a new arithmetic." She looked around her as if the ground might correct her posture. "If you ever require assistance—" She did not finish. The sentence was too new for her to carry. Eveline inclined her head a degree. "I will take care of my own," she said, "but I accept the intention." She let the woman go then, not because she deserved it, but because Eveline did not intend to let the past spend her future. Millicent turned and left,
smaller as she reached the road, as if distance preferred her that way. That evening, Eveline baked bread. She pressed her thumb into the center of each roll, a well like an eye. Children gathered and adults hovered, doing adult things that were actually the work of learning. She told them about vowels without calling them that. She told them about the way dough rises if given time and warmth, and how people do too. She told them how heat makes the inside of a loaf into chambers where breath lives, and how words do that too if you let them. She set the rolls to cool, and the room smelled like a promise without a knife in it. Jonah came up behind her, lifted one and blew on his fingers, surprised as a child at his own impatience. "Teach me next," he said. "Proper, not just the way a man recognizes his own name on a scrap." She handed him a bit of chalk and pointed to the doorframe. He bent his big shoulders and wrote his letters careful, and they looked like a line of men standing and refusing to move. She did not cry, not then. Later, when the children had gone to the pallets and the old ones had let sleep do the stitching that pain had tried to unpick, Eveline went outside. The river was far, but she could hear it sometimes when the wind decided to carry news. She took the blue bead from her pocket. She had thought it was lost and then found it in the hem of her apron on a day when she needed proof, and held it up to the last piece of sky. It caught the light and made a circle. "Before we jump back in," she whispered to the dark because old habits pretend to be company, and then laughed, catching herself. "Nah, we jumped already." She tucked the bead back where it would not fall and went inside. The ledger of the parish grew fat with new entries the priest spelled how he could, and Eveline corrected with the kindness that did not lessen the exactness. Men came through with eyes that could not rest, and she taught their eyes a chair. Women arrived with babies already suspicious of the world and learned to forgive the world in small increments when the babies laughed at her flour-dusted hands. Children grew, and when talk of war walked through the door and sat itself down like an unwelcome cousin, Eveline did not bow to it. She counted her bread and her letters. She kept a list of names in her head that could become a litany if the worst came, and sometimes at night she spoke them to the boards, and the boards held them safe. Years later, how many depends on which calendar you choose, someone asked her whether she regretted the night of the harvest supper. Her needs were kneading. Her hands did not pause. She measured her words the way she measured salt, with memory. "I regret the need. I do not regret the door." She lived long enough to see Isaiah open a shop with his name painted on the glass and spelled right. She lived long enough to see Cora put letters in other mouths with the same patience she had used on custards, a patience that hardens into a spine if you let it. She lived long enough to watch Jonah fall asleep in a chair and not startle at footsteps, his body learning it was allowed to rest like a citizen. She lived long enough to bury Aunt Mariah with a hymn older than any law and plant the pouch with her because something should not be inherited by hands but by soil. When she died, if you need the fact, it was in her bed with dough under her nails, which is how a person ought to go if they have spent their life turning hunger into something that does not hurt people. No one wrote a notice that told a hunter where to carry his gun to find her story. People told it in kitchens, which is the right place for a story born of heat and patience and a refusal to be eaten. And if you go to Natchez and stand in certain light, some days the river will give you a sound like laughter that was not allowed at the time and has been saved up. If you bend and touch the earth where Cain once stood in neat, cruel rows, you might feel a pulse and think it is your own. It is not. It is the count the dead keep, so the living do not forget the arithmetic that saved them. They call her Eveline of Natchez because names need prepositions sometimes to remember what they're built on. But those who ate her bread and learned her letters and felt their spines remember themselves call her something else in private. Door.